Let's put one. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start. Seems like a light class today. I don't know why, but maybe people knew what I was going to talk about. And they just wanted to stay away from the controversy. Anyways, nevertheless, it's good to see you all on this last week of our classes. The Advent season has started for Catholics, so the preparation for Christmas time. And actually, I'm Eastern Catholic. Our preparation started back on November 15th with the feast day of Saint Philip the Apostle. But I haven't really done much yet to prepare myself, so I'm still working at it, But nevertheless, we're in the Christmas season, and so I thought I would dress up a little, and I'll have some stuff on Thursday as well for our last class. So I sent out an email about quiz number 5. Quiz number 5 is up on Canvas, so you can take it. As I said in the email, I apologize for being late on it. That's my fault. So whatever grade you get, hello, Mr. Kazin, whatever grade you get, I will add 5 points to that to make up. I don't want to extend. I know in the syllabus it says I'll extend the time, but since it's so close to finals week, I don't really want to extend the time. I want you to be able to focus on studying for finals, have the quiz done, and then focus on studying for your finals and whatnot, because I know you have other classes than this, but also to study for this. So I'll just add 5 points to whatever grade you get onto the test. I still want you to take the quiz. It's still important because the questions will still show up on the final because we covered the information. And as I said, when you're doing the quizzes, you're actually studying for the test. These are the same questions. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel for the final exam. I'm basically going to be testing you cumulatively on what we've. Yeah, thank you, Mr. I'll spit it out. Anyways, cumulatively on what we've learned in the course. But also remember that this week, because I'm talking about abortion and God willing contraception that the Lord wants me to. This will also show up. There will be a few questions on the exam for that. Remember, we don't have a quiz 6, so just pay attention for abortion and contraception because some questions will show up on the final exam since we've covered the material. Okay, and I will get to your papers when I get to them. I apologize on that. I'll start working on the papers so I can get those grades in as well. I got Mr. Kazin, right? Yes. Somebody else? Oh, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas. Okay, so let's get busy. Feels almost surreal to be talking about abortion and stuff like that when I'm dressed up like this. Nevertheless, has to be done. Well, it doesn't have to be done, but I'm doing it. So abortion and contraception. When I'm talking about these things, even though I'm not covering everything that I wanted to in the syllabus, I'm covering some things. I want you to notice how I'm trying to bring everything that we've learned, the principles that we've learned, and applying them now to practical matters. We talked about euthanasia, now we're talking about abortion. Whether you agree or not is, it's great if we all agree, but it's also okay if we don't. More importantly is to show you how to think through these ethical issues, because you will have at times to think through ethical issues. So I want to show you how to do it and how these principles that we've learned, maybe a long time ago in the course, actually do apply to concrete situations. So we're talking about abortion today, which is essentially the act of eliminating or terminating a pregnancy. Comes from the Latin word aborto, which means to bring forth prematurely. Can also mean to miscarry. Okay? So that's just simply the meaning of it, okay, of the word abortion. Now, the question, we want to define our terms. What is a pregnancy? If abortion is eliminating or terminating a pregnancy, what is a pregnancy? Hello, Ms. Dela Cruz. I don't know, I'm trying not to watch Ms. Reeser eat her bacon. Okay. What is a pregnancy? Okay, we know what a pregnancy is, but how do we define it? It's the state or condition of containing unborn offspring within a body. Notice I didn't say a woman's body or a human body, because pregnancy occurs with other animal species as well. Other mammalians get pregnant as well, just like humans get pregnant. We're mammals, so we get pregnant pretty much the same way other mammals do. So having an unborn offspring within a body is pregnancy. It comes from two Latin words, pre, which means before, if you preheat an oven, you heat the oven before you heat it. It's like pre-boarding an airplane. You get on before you get on. As one comedian once said, it's like, it doesn't make any sense, but you understand what it means. Pre means before or in front of, and genio in Latin means to beget, to bear something, as in bearing a child, to bring forth or produce. And I think this is kind of a literal, maybe a literal depiction of what is going on, because I have this picture of a pregnant woman. Because yes, she does have her when a woman gets pregnant, it is before her, it is pre, it is before or in front of her. The production, she is bearing before her literally, because that's where the child is, in the uterus, in the womb. Contraception comes from two Latin words. The first one, contra, to be against something. Contra, against. Okay? Pro and con, same thing. If you're pro something, you're for it. If you're con, you're against it. Comes from the same word, contra. And ception, which is conception. So contraception is the act of preventing conception from occurring in a female's reproductive system. Okay, so you're against it. You want to inhibit the action of conception or fertilization in either the fallopian tubes or the uterus, whatever. Now again, to define our terms, what is conception, or also fertilization? Conception is the process in which a female's egg is fertilized and implanted in a female's reproductive system. Actually, I didn't say implanted. I say fertilized in a female's reproductive system. Excuse me, I should correct my own notes here. Cross that out. Is fertilized in a female's reproductive system. It comes from the Latin word concipio, which means to take or lay hold of. Cipio is related to our word, well, we get it from the same root word in Latin, which means to capture. Okay, so to take hold of something or to receive something. The sperm is received by the ovum, by the egg. It's taken hold of in a manner of speaking. And so you have conception, you have concipio. Okay? Another way of describing conception is with this word fertilization. And I would say they're synonymous in a way. When doctors or physicians or nurses talk about conception, you could also say fertilization. I think maybe fertilization is a more specific term than conception. Maybe conception refers to the whole process, whereas fertilization is more specific to the act, which is to fertilize something in general means to make it capable of growing or developing. And we use this term in general because it doesn't have to just refer to human reproduction. It can refer to just, a farmer planting crops. You have to fertilize the crops. Why? Because you want them to grow. We want the crops to reproduce, to develop. So you fertilize them. You make them fruitful. You make them bear fruit. And that's the root meaning of the word fertile, from the Latin word fero, to bear something, to produce it, to yield. You want the crops to produce. Same thing with fertilization in a human being. When fertilization happens, you've produced something. Something starts to grow. It's fruitful, fertilis, fruitful, fertile. Same word in English. So, fertilization is the act of fertilizing. The act of making fertile. It's the state or condition in which a female gamete is fused or comes together with a male gamete. Male gamete. I'm assuming we're all adults here. We've all gone to high school. We've had sex ed class. I'm assuming we all know how sex works. The basics of how sex works, okay? If you don't, then you're probably doing it wrong. But, you probably understand, what happens and then what can happen after sex in the woman's body, all right? The basics. So I don't have to go into that. But, a woman produces what are called, well, okay, I'll define this right now. There are sex cells. That's what a gamete is. Another term for a gamete is a sex cell. Miss Taya's, oh, hey, Da. Hello, Miss. Gametes are the sex cells. Actually, it's interesting in medicine. I learned this as I was doing my research. They're actually technically called germ cells. It's kind of weird to think that humans come from germs. You know what I'm saying? Not a very high view of us, Lord, But anyways, their gametes are sex cells, and the sex cells of, and I'll show this to you, a picture to you in a moment. Well, actually, I will show it to you now. Whoops. Could also say conception. I already said that, but fertilization and conception are pretty much synonymous. They pretty much are the same thing. Here we are. I have a picture here. The sex cells, the female gamete. Oh, Ms. Mitchell. Good morning. The female gamete is the egg, which in medical jargon and in scientific jargon is called either the oocyte, that's not a misspelling, it is the oocyte or oocyte, or the ovum in Latin, means the same thing. Oo means an egg, from Latin, and an oocyte is kind of an earlier version of the ovum. The ovum is kind of like the mature egg that the woman produces, and the male gamete, the male sex cell, is the spermatozoon, or as we call it generally, or I shouldn't say generally, but as we call it, sperm. And the mature male or female germ cell has half of the each one has half of the chromosomal set. So they have 23 chromosomes each, which is different because every cell in our body has 46 chromosomes. Every cell. The only cells that don't are the sex cells, the gametes. They have what are called haploid chromosomal sets. They have half the chromosomal set. Why? Because each one contributes in the formation of the zygote, of the new, we could say a new human being, but we'll say zygote, embryo, fetus. And when they combine, when each gamete combines with the gamete of the opposite sex, it forms what's called a diploid individual. Diploid means having two sets. Di means two, coming from Greek. Di means two. So you have haploid. Each one has half of the chromosomal set. And then when they combine, you have a new individual entity which has a diploid set, so 46. So it's easy to remember this. If you've ever seen commercials for 23andMe, where you send in your genetic material, you swab your mouth or something, you send it to this company, and they go through your chromosomes and your genes, and they send you back a report, and you can see where you came from and stuff like that, what you're connected to, what parts of the world you're connected to. That's what's going on. Thus is created a new individual. When these two gametes come together and the chromosomes fuse together, come together as well, thus is created a new individual entity in its initial stages of development, the zygote. We can also call it an embryo. Technically, it's the earliest stage is called a zygote. but for simplicity's sake, I'll call it an embryo as well. Now, generally, this is, for most people or for a lot of people, this is a good thing. People want this to happen. People want to be mothers and fathers, and so they want this process to happen of fertilization and conception and pregnancy, but not always. And this has been a law, and how do you prevent pregnancy and conception? And this has been a long-standing issue within, I'll move on to this. This is just a video about how pregnancy works, but I can pass on from that. This has been a long-standing issue. I'm not going to go through everything, the whole history of, say, contraception or abortion, but I'll just give you one indication, one of the oldest indications that we have that trying to avoid conception or birth is an old activity. And the oldest indication we have, historical indication, is from this thing called the Cahun Gynecological Papyrus. Papyrus is a bit of ancient paper that people wrote on. And this was found in 1889, discovered in 1889 in Egypt. And it dates from around 1825 BC. So it's pretty old, over 3,000, almost 4,000 years old. And it's our earliest. Not only is it a medical text in general, if you read the whole papyrus, which we have in fragments, it's clearly a medical text. It's dealing with all sorts of medical issues and diseases and sicknesses and illnesses. But in the context of that, it describes contraceptive measures. So it's our earliest historical datum that we have of contraception, or it could also be abortion. It's not clear. It describes methods for preventing either conception or birth. But as you can see from the text, we don't have the whole text. It's fragmented. So it's not clear from the text, because it's too fragmented, to be absolutely sure whether what it's describing is preventing conception or preventing birth. But it's certainly trying to prevent something that has to do with female reproduction. And so in this, which is why it's called the gynecological papyrus. Gune in Latin means, Gune in Greek means female, a female human being. And so it's dealing with gynecology and women's issues. So, for example, in the Cahun Gynecological Papyrus, it suggests pressing crocodile's dung into the cervix of the woman. It seems to prevent, and is this a contraceptive measure? Is it meant to prevent? Is it like a diaphragm, a type of ancient diaphragm that would prevent the sperm from getting to the egg? Don't know. It's not clear, but it recommends that. It also recommends sprinkling honey over the woman's womb, over her stomach. Is that meant to cause an abortion? It's not sure, but it's something. It's obvious that it's meant to prevent either conception or the birth. So this has been an old issue, that people want to prevent conception and pregnancy. Okay, Ms. Reyes. Reyes. Do. Da. So we missed Mr. Saravo. Is that it? Okay. First, we'll talk about abortion. Whoops. Abortion, which is something which actively or passively brings about the death of the conceptus. Conceptus is a Latin term for what has been conceived. And it's a general term. It includes zygote, embryo, blastocyst, fetus, the whole developmental stages of of the unborn offspring, the conceptus, what has been conceived in the womb. Lost him. What are the types of abortion? There are different types of abortion. There are two kinds. There is spontaneous abortion and there is induced abortion. Spontaneous can also be called indirect abortion, and induced abortion can be called direct. And under induced, there are two subsets to induced abortion. There's medical induced abortion, and then there is surgical induced abortion. Let's talk about spontaneous or indirect abortion first. Whoops. Oopsie doodle. Make sure that's coming. Yeah, it's coming. What does the word spontaneous mean? Well, it comes from a Latin phrase, sponte, which means of one's free will, of one's own accord, or willingly. Which isn't very helpful, because a spontaneous abortion is really not something that's done willingly. Nevertheless, that's, the word comes from where it comes from. But spontaneous means the state or condition of developing without any apparent external influence, cause, or force. Something that just happens. It's the word we use for something that just happens. Doesn't seem to have a cause, doesn't seem to have any reason for happening. It's just something, it's spontaneous. It happens, okay? It's done on a whim, maybe. There's no external constraint. Something that's spontaneous comes from a natural feeling or a native tendency. According to the Johns Hopkins Manual of Gynecology and Obstetrics, 4th edition, it defines a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage as generally defined as the spontaneous loss of a pre-viable pregnancy. So spontaneous, okay, it's something that develops without any apparent cause, and it's a pre-viable pregnancy. It's unborn offspring, and it's pre-viable, meaning it's viable means able to live. So it's before it can live outside of the body of the mother or the woman. Viable, all right, able to live. You live. So it's pre-viable. And as you can see from the definition, it's also called a miscarriage. In common terms, people won't say, or a doctor won't say to a woman, "Oh, it looks like you've had a spontaneous abortion," but which is the technical term. They'll probably use the more common term, which is a miscarriage. But technically, it is an abortion in medical terms. According to the statistics and what we know, about 30 to 40% of conceptions end in miscarriages. So while while the majority, 60% for the most part, continue on into would seem to be a healthy pregnancy at least, a significant number of conceptions are failed pregnancies, they're miscarriages, and they're expelled from the body, or the woman's body, for whatever reason. There's the body but the body somehow intuits that there's some disease or some pathological condition to the embryo, and it's expelled. Or we talked about ectopic pregnancies, which the embryo is implanted in the wrong place, which can sometimes miscarry. When they don't miscarry, then you need an operation, but they can miscarry because it's in the wrong place. It's not where it's supposed to be, and the body seems to know this somehow. So yeah, there are indications, or if somehow the embryo is not healthy, the body will just expel it. It'll be a miscarriage. That's spontaneous. To induce something this is where it's direct and active. This is, a spontaneous abortion is something that's passive. It passively happens. The woman might not even know it until she has, until it's expelled from the body and there's blood and there's the remnants of the embryo or the fetus, and then the woman realizes, something happened, But an induced abortion is direct and active. Which is, you can see from the word to induce, to induco in Latin, to lead into something, means to cause or bring about something by artificial means. So there's intervention going on here. You're actively doing something to bring something about, to induce it. Da, 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 da. Okay, so we'll get to that in a moment. An induced abortion, although as I told you, Ms. Taya Zoheda, hey, Ms. Taya Zoheda, how do you like the hat? You like it? You like it? You approve? Anyways, whereas a spontaneous abortion is technically, in medical terms, an abortion. Induced abortion, I would say, is abortion properly speaking, because it's deliberate, and it's a deliberate and purposeful attempt to eliminate the existence of the pregnancy through the intended death and removal of the embryo or the fetus, you could say. And there are two types, as I told you. There's medical and there's surgical. The picture I have on the PowerPoint shows you an example of techniques for medical abortion. Medical abortion involves the prescription of drugs, medications, medical, okay, such as these two you see in the picture, mifepristone, and in the background, maybe you can see that misoprostol. Those are usually given together to a woman in the early stages of pregnancy. Mifepristone is also known colloquially as RU-486. You may have heard of it as that rather than its technical pharmacological name of mifepristone, RU-486. And what do they do? Taken together, they can't be taken separately, but they're usually taken together. They're most effective taken together. They degrade the lining of the uterus. I had a, was that euthanasia? No, for hysterectomy. Oh, yes, I had a picture. I wish I had put this on the PowerPoint. Okay. Well, anyways, I'll draw a uterus on the board. You got the fallopian tubes going out like this. You got the ovaries here. The ovaries produce the eggs. Okay. So, whoops, this is the corpus. Anyway, so this is a woman's womb, a uterus for the most part. Down here is the cervix. Okay? And there's a lining along the wall called the endometrium. And that's where ideally the embryo should implant and start developing into a fetus and then eventually into a baby, et cetera, and so forth. What these drugs do is they degrade the uterus's mucus lining, this endometrium, which is a mucus lining, so that the embryo or the fetus cannot, if it's attached, it can't remain attached anymore, and it will detach. And also, these drugs initiate contractions in the uterus and in the cervix, so that it will expel the embryo after it detaches. Okay, so that's a medical abortion. And I don't think I have anything. Okay, that's normative principles for conscious formation. We'll get there in a second. Surgical abortion, which I don't have any pictures of, and I'm not going to show you any pictures of. I'm sure you can imagine. Requires minor or sometimes major surgery, an operative procedure, and which kind of surgery that's given is based on the term of the pregnancy the woman is. You can usually most abortions are medical abortions, and they're given in very early stages within like the first 2 months that a woman realizes that she's pregnant from the last time she's had her period. Okay, and then she misses a period, and then she realizes something might be amiss. Something's up. She has her period, and then when it regularly should happen, it doesn't happen. So you go to the doctor, or you take a pregnancy test, and then you go to the doctor, and so like 2 months, within like 2 months of the last period of the woman, is when they usually do medical. After that, you're going to probably have to have a surgical. In the early term, the conceptus can simply be what's called aspirated. That is, it's removed via suction. To aspirate means to remove something through suction, vacuum suction. to aspirate. I wrote a lot on the board already. That's if it's early term. In later terms, the conceptus is scraped off the uterine wall because it's attached. Well, it's probably attached in the aspiration stage as well, but it's small. But if it's, when it becomes somewhat larger, that's not going to maybe be as effective. So the conceptus is scraped off the uterine wall, may also have to be dismembered depending on its size, and the contents will then be evacuated via vacuum suction. This is called a dilation and an evacuation. You dilate the cervix, you widen the cervix of the woman, and then you evacuate the contents. You remove the contents. Which is called, I should write that on the board. I don't know why I didn't put it on the PowerPoint. Oh well. Dilation and evacuation, or as it's referred to in shorthand, a D and E. Now the next kind, if it's in much later term, larger to deal with, then it's a dilation and extraction, which is a D and X. D and X. In that case, in the latest term, the conceptus may be partially removed from the womb, and the head, being the largest part, will have to be mechanically collapsed to bring about the death of the fetus and then to remove it, just to get it out, because otherwise it's too big for the size. Even though you've dilated the cervix, it's too big. So that would be surgical. So those are surgical. So those are the kinds. Those are the types of surgical abortions. Now, normative principles for conscience formation. What are our normative principles for conscience formation? We have 3 of them, Ms. De La Cruz. 3. Truth, natural law, and positive law. Okay. Let's start with what we can say about these procedures and abortion in general that is true. It seems to be true. Hopefully it's true. If it's not true, then challenge me and we can have a discussion. Just go back to that. Okay, we'll come to that. Talking about spontaneous abortion, which is the first kind I talked about. Spontaneous abortion seems to be the body's natural response to an embryo that is diseased or otherwise non-viable. So as such, it's a defensive measure. It's like when your body sends white blood cells to attack a virus or a bacterium that's in your body, okay? The body attacks something that's going to harm it, that's going to harm the body. So it's a defensive measure. The embryo, there's something wrong with the embryo, and so that it can't be part of the woman's body, otherwise it might harm it, and so it's expelled. The woman has no control over whether the body will miscarry the embryo. It just does it. In fact, as I said, the woman might not even know that it's happened until it happens. Provided the mother hasn't done anything to warrant a miscarriage, doing things like, drinking alcohol, smoking, etc., overexertion. These are all things that can cause a miscarriage. Provided the mother or the woman hasn't done things that warranted a miscarriage, there's no responsibility for the action. Now, she might have done these things like drink alcohol and drink coffee and drink and smoke because she wanted a miscarriage, and then she got what she wanted. But usually you don't. And once a woman knows that she's pregnant, she avoids these things. But if a woman doesn't, then there's some responsibility, there's some culpability for that action if a miscarriage occurs. But generally, that's not the case. A woman doesn't intend it because she might not even know she's really pregnant, or might want the child and is expecting to have a child, but the miscarriage ensues anyways for whatever reason. So I think that we can classify a miscarriage or qualify it as an actus humanum. Remember, actus humanum. All right, there's actus humanum, Ms. McLeod, and there's Actus hominis, Mr. Kazin. Yes, yes, human moral act. There are actus humanum. What is an actus humanum? It is a biological process or processes of the human person over which the human being has no control, like breathing. Okay, like breathing. Or say someone has whatchamacallit, you have what is it called? MLS, not MLS. We're trying to think what's his name has. Michael J. Fox. I think it's MLS. Well, anyways, conditions which can make your motor responses jerky, and you move a lot, and your arms move and your head moves, and you can't control how your body moves. You might move your arm and hit somebody with this condition. But it's an actus humanum. You don't intend to do that. You're not intending harm to somebody else if you inadvertently slap them in the face. You have a medical condition, which causes your motor movements to be outside of your control, okay? That's an actus humanum. You have no responsibility for that. It's like breathing. You have no control, and hence an actus humanum has no moral content. It's not done with freedom or the intelligence. So spontaneous, I think, a spontaneous abortion can be qualified as that, and there's no responsibility for it. There's no moral problem with it. It's something, it's natural. It may not be a good natural thing that happens in the case of the woman wanting the child, but it's a natural event. Induced abortion is different, since there is the element of active choice. A woman decides she doesn't want to be pregnant and takes active measures to have the pregnancy removed or ended. Because the woman is engaging her intelligence and her will, she thinks about it, she deliberates, what do I want to do with this? And then chooses the action of what she wants to do. She wills to do something. She wills some activity. She directs herself towards some goal, which is the essence of a moral object. You're directing yourself towards a goal. You're doing something which directs you towards a goal. Then we have here moral choice and a moral object. Okay, so the induced abortion is different. And now I'm getting to truth more properly speaking, I should say. I'm in the area of truth. The immediate purpose of abortion is to end the pregnancy. I think that's obvious, and not really, I don't think that's a controversial statement. It's abortion ends the pregnancy, whether it's a spontaneous abortion or it's an induced abortion. And this is done by removing the entity which is causing the pregnancy, the zygote, the embryo, the fetus, at whatever stage of development it's in. To do this also necessarily and intentionally entails causing damage or destruction to that entity. Why? What's the purpose? Well, so that it's removed and that the existence or life of that entity is ended. Unless the woman is deciding, I will give birth to this child, but I'll give it up for adoption or whatever, then of course, the entity is allowed to live. But 9 times out of 10, that's not what's going on in abortion. For an unwanted pregnancy, you don't want the pregnancy. You want the thing that's there that's making you pregnant to no longer be in existence anymore, even as say a live birth that's adopted. Abortion as a procedure doesn't remove or treat anything that is diseased, damaged, or pathological in the woman. A pregnant woman is not treated as if she has a disease, even though pregnancy it can be a threat to a woman. I mean, I'm going to say a threat, but that's the wrong word. Well, can be a threat if it goes south. It's a risk. It's a risk because pregnancy changes the woman's body, her metabolism. All sorts of medical conditions can arise that you didn't know that were there before. The fetus can get sick in the woman, even for a wanted pregnancy. The fetus can get sick and might require treatment, even surgery in the womb. All sorts of things. The woman can experience bleeding during the birth and can even die, be exposed to death. So there are certainly risks in pregnancy. But it's not a disease. It's not treated like you don't go to the doctor because you're unhealthy or unwell. It's not the same type of thing that's going on. And having an embryo or being pregnant, with unborn offspring, is not, the embryo isn't damaged or pathological. It's not a pathology. If it were, then the body would recognize that and would spontaneously abort it itself. On the contrary, usually what abortion does is, at least induced abortion, what induced abortion is doing, is intervening in what is a natural process and is operating on an entity which, for all intents and purposes, is healthy. It's not damaged. It's not diseased. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. That's the problem. It's there. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Darn it. So the abortive process removes the health, which is wholeness, of the embryo or fetus, so that it is no longer healthy and can't survive. So the act of killing it, killing it is that's just what's going on. You could say you're terminating the life or removing the existence if you want, but it's basically the same thing. You're removing the existence. Removing the existence of the embryo is not accidental. It's not unintended or tolerated. Rather, it's intentional. So, sometimes people will try to use the principle of double effect for justifying, say, an abortion and say, well, the good effect is the woman doesn't want to be pregnant, but the bad effect is that the fetus has to die. And the woman just intends the good effect of not being pregnant, but tolerates the bad effect of the fetus dying. Well, it's not really true. By actively removing its existence, you are still intending the bad effect in a way. After fertilization, the zygote is alive. I'm just going to state some things that seem to be, sometimes they're debated, but they seem to be true. At least to me, they seem to be true. You may agree or disagree. But alive. I say it's alive because according to medical science and according to biology, the zygote, the newly formed organism from the gametes, does all the things that an alive thing does. It grows, it metabolizes nutrients, it starts reproducing through cell division. These are all things that in biology are indicators of life, not just human life, but any life. These are what you look for if you're a biologist to see if something's alive. It grows, it eats, okay? It produces energy from nutrients, and it reproduces itself. The zygote is human. Obviously, if the suppliers of the genetic material are human, the chromosomes are human, then it's safe to assume that the resulting zygote will be human. One doesn't expect, if you have two human parents, you don't expect the woman to give birth to a horse. You know what I'm saying? You don't expect, something totally different to arise. And you can identify, it's the zygote is identifiable as human. You can look at it and analyze it and look at its chromosomes and the genetic makeup and see that this has the chromosomes of a human, of a Homo sapien, and not something else. Now, is the zygote a person? I would say this is true for the following reasons, but some people debate this. A person is something that's rational, that's individual, and exists as what it is. Okay, those are three conditions for being a person. Now, a zygote at the very earliest stage of human development, you might say, well, it's not rational, but it's not operating rationally. It's in the stage of development, but it has the potentiality for rationality that's built into the DNA. How do we know this? Because the DNA will later create the physical material organ, which we call the brain or the neocortex, which allows the human being to start exercising this potentiality of rationality, of thinking and thought. It's at a certain stage, it's just at the earliest stage of development, but the potential is there. You might say, well, yeah, but it's too early a stage. But when do we cut off the stages? Because if you just look at biology, human biology, and I'm assuming we might have someone in class here who's 25 years old, but I'm assuming most of you are in your early 20s. The prefrontal cortex of your brain is the last part to develop, and it doesn't reach its maximum volume until you're 25 years old. And remember, the neocortex is what you used for rational thinking. So technically, if you want to just think about in physical material terms, you're not able to fully think rationally until you're 25, because that's when biologists are able to identify, at least for the human brain, it reaches its full developmental structure. And then it keeps developing after that until it starts degrading when you start getting into like your 60s and 70s and you start losing brain cells and stuff like that. And hopefully bad things don't happen to you. But nevertheless, the brain is, so, there's a spectrum of development of the human brain and rationality that goes on. The same thing could be said about the reproductive organs. The reproductive organs are not there fully formed in the zygote, but they are there potentially. Just as they're there potentially in a 9-year-old. The 9-year-old's sexual organs are not fully developed, and then they start fully developing around 11 or 12, depending on whether you're male or female, and then they start working. But they were there before, they just weren't doing anything. They weren't, for a male, they weren't generating sperm. For the female, they weren't producing eggs. Not yet. The zygote exists as what it is. It has a human nature. If it's human, if it's part of the Homo sapiens, it has a genetic structure that's human, then it would assume a human nature. It is what it is. And it is an individual. It exists apart from the woman. Even though it's dependent on her at that stage of development, it's doing its own thing. It has its own functions. It's dividing its cells. It's creating organs. It's developing. It's doing all sorts of things. It's again, metabolizing nutrients. It's doing things apart from the host, you could say, that the host has no control over and doesn't have to tell the fetus, okay, fetus, now you're going to eat, or okay, fetus, now you're going to pump blood. Now, okay, it's just doing it naturally because it's individual. Natural law. Oops. Sorry, I forgot this PowerPoint. I forget. Okay, so it's alive, it's human, and it's a person. I just thought this was a cool picture because this is maybe, how is it, 9 weeks? So it's a little over 2 months old. This is still, it would qualify as an embryo. I think it's just on the cusp of becoming what obstetricians would call, baby doctors would call a fetus. It's about 1.5 centimeters long. I wish they did it in our, anyways, but it's centimeters. So how big would that be? Maybe this big? I'm trying to think how big a centimeter is. So it's not that big, but it's big enough. I just thought this was a cool picture because you see, like the ribs. You start seeing the ribs there, and you can. Well, here's the placenta. You see the toes on the feet, the fingers, the eyes are forming, the little ears are starting to form. You start having the cranium form. According to the person who took this picture, it's a male. I don't know how you would tell unless, I don't know if it's like a cat where you turn it over and, kitten, you turn it over. Oh, okay, that's a boy. I don't know, because the placenta is kind of hiding it. But anyways. Okay, natural law. What comes into play with natural law? Well, we have the first principle of practical reason, which, as we know, is to do good and avoid evil. To do good and avoid evil. And evil is something which does not benefit us. It is a disvalue. It does not perfect us. In fact, it takes away something that perfects us. And I would say, according to the natural law, the direct killing, of anything is not a good or benefit to that thing, though it depends on what thing you're killing. If you're killing an animal for food, that's a different situation. But in the case of, say, a human being, the direct killing of a human being is not a good or benefit to that human being. Instead, it's the removal of a good, which is existence. And existence is the first inclination of human nature, according to our friend Thomas Aquinas, to preserve life. So an induced abortion, according to the natural law, could be said to violate that principle of respect for the sanctity or the value. Another way of putting it is the value of human life, and which is that no one who is innocent or hasn't committed any action that's punishable by death who doesn't deserve to be harmed should not be harmed, especially not in the ultimate way of terminating that person's active existence. Except for serious, I mean, when we could talk about capital punishment, but that's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. But there are different ethical issues with capital punishment. But in this case, you're dealing with, I think a being that exists clearly, innocently, that there's no judgment against the person in a court that the person deserves to die. It's a decision that's being made between pretty much two people, the woman and her doctor. The second inclination of human nature is, well, I'll come to that in a second. Let me continue on with the first inclination. Sorry about that. The most basic inclination is to preserve one's life, to remain alive, to remain in existence. And this existence is due to any person as a matter of the virtue of justice. You give to someone what is due that person, okay, because it's due to you as well. And to exist is a matter of justice. It's a right that's based on human nature. So no one's right to be alive is more or less operative or recognizable than another's. So it's not like white people have more of a right to exist than black people or yellow people. Some people used to think that, and some people sometimes still do. Even people who are what you would say are people of the same color, we might say they're the same color, like in the Sudan, where they're now you have Arab-descended Sudanese who are killing the African-descended Sudanese who are, we would say, black. I guess we would say that the Arab-descended Sudanese are people of color because they have dark brown skin or light brown skin, and they're killing each other. Or at least the Arab Sudanese in Sudan, the country of the Sudan, are trying to kill the Africans because of racism. They think that they're subhuman. They call them slaves, which is their version of the N-word. So people still believe that, based on that some people's lives are some people have more of a right to be alive than others. But based on the natural law, that shouldn't be so. Justice is owed everyone equally. It should be equitable. And so my right to exist is no more and no less than your right to exist. Now, in the case of the woman and the embryo, you have two beings, you have two entities here. And I think that you could say that's also under truth, because even a woman who doesn't want the pregnancy, it's unwanted pregnancy, recognizes the entity is present. That's what the problem is, that there's an entity present that she doesn't want and wants to have removed. But both are in existence. Both are in existence. Both are alive, you could say, or living. And so they're both actuating this right to be alive. The difference is that they're actuating it in different, relationships. The mother is fully independent and the fetus or the embryo is not fully independent. It's dependent on the mother. And also certainly at different stages of development. The fetus or the embryo is just at the beginning of human life, of its human existence, whereas the mother may be, obviously, well, girls can start having children sometimes around 10 or 11 once they become fertile, once they start producing gametes. So whatever, certainly many years older. The second inclination of human nature is procreation and the rearing of young. We should be drawn to that, and many people are. Some aren't. That's okay. I'm making no judgments on anybody, not even people who've had abortions. I'm not, that's not my job here. I'm not here as a judge or make any sort of statement about anybody. I'm just here. But we generally see procreation or the creation of new life. Mr. Sarabo. Okay. The second inclination, the perpetuation of life is a good thing. Humans rejoice at the newness of life, like a baby. they also grieve at its loss when life is lost, when someone dies. So we assume, we seem to have this natural inclination towards life, towards procreation. We see it as a good thing. Procreation is also a good of woman when it happens. By procreating, a woman participates in the creation of new human life, a human person whom she can love and who can return her love. She creates a new human entity, and there's also a relationship that's created there. So that's seen as a good or a benefit, because remember the third, I didn't put this on the PowerPoint, but the third natural inclination, or the third inclination of human nature is community. Remember, community with God, but community with other peoples. We are social creatures. Yes, there are people who want to be alone and who live alone, and that's fine. But, you know, any mental health professional will tell you that one of the things that helps in mental health is having friendships, having people, you know, a social network. It's not being alone. That actually degrades your mental health and doesn't help you, because you don't have anyone there to talk to or to give you compassion. You're on your own. So that's kind of a scientific, not a proof, but what's the word I'm looking for? Substantiation of this third natural inclination, which is community. And as soon as there's a new entity existing in the woman's womb, she's created a community. It's now her and this entity. And if she chooses to accept this entity and keep it, then this relationship continues throughout their lives. It's not a one-time thing and it's, okay, I was pregnant and now I'm not, and boom, the child's gone. No, the child grows up, the child goes to school, goes to Gwynedd Mercy, hopefully graduates. Don't quote me on that. Let's see how it goes, Ms. Reyes. But graduates, goes on, maybe has a family of her own or his own, and there's a whole relationship created. Okay, now moving on to positive law. Positive law, just as in the case of euthanasia, kind of fluctuates. There's a period where the positive, although not so, maybe it has fluctuated in recent years, but there used to be kind of a general understanding, just unlike euthanasia. Most of the laws forbade it, and then there was a liberalizing trend. The same thing we see in abortion, although there are exceptions. In the early American Republic, from the formation of the formation proper of the United States of America under the Constitution, which occurs in 1789, until the late 1800s, abortion was generally permitted. It was generally accepted during this period of time from 18 to 21 weeks, when before the fetus's movement could be felt in the mother's womb. Once you could start feeling the movement of the fetus in the womb, it was not permitted. It was impermissible. This period of time is called the quickening. Which I guess is an Anglo-Saxon word for movement. So, it wasn't considered to be alive until there was quickening, which occurred sometimes after the 21st week. But starting in the late 1800s, maybe around the 1880s until the 1950s, abortion was outlawed or highly restricted in every state of the United States, every state that there was. Remember, states were added during this period of time. And in the 1960s, abortion laws started to become liberalized, if I remember correctly from my reading. First, I think in Colorado. Colorado decriminalized abortion in cases of rape, incest, causing physical harm to the mother. In 1971, I think, Hawaii became the first state to decriminalize abortion. In all cases, it was basically abortion on demand. Notice this was before the famous abortion decision in 1973, which is called Roe versus Wade. So this is where the U.S. Supreme Court comes in. 1973, there was a challenge to a Texas statute that made it a crime to perform an abortion except to save the mother's life. So this was challenged. There's a woman who was pregnant, and she decided to challenge it. She actually never had the woman who did it, Jane Roe, Roe versus Wade. Her name in life was Norma Leah McCorvey, but she was called Jane Roe in the documents, the court documents, hence Roe versus Wade. She actually, gave birth to the child and I think put it up for adoption. She didn't keep it. But she had to be pregnant in order to have standing, because if she wasn't pregnant, she couldn't argue for an abortion. And what happened? Roe versus Wade, we had a 7-2 decision in favor of Jane Roe, finding that the 14th Amendment of the Constitution had a right of privacy or right to privacy, which included abortion. In general, and I'm not going to tell you the whole decision, but because it's been superseded now, as we'll find out in a moment. But growing, and I grew up with Roe versus Wade most of my life, so you hear a lot of things in the media and stuff like that, and most of it's wrong. It's not telling the truth about what Roe versus Wade actually decided. What did it decide in a nutshell? In general, Roe versus Wade said that a state could not interfere in a woman's decision to abort in the first 2 trimesters. The state had no compelling interest to do anything, other than maybe later on in like the second trimester to license the doctor who would do it, make sure that the medical facilities were clean and appropriate for the abortion. But that was about it. It was minimal interest. But there was no intervention by the state in the woman's decision. After that, and starting in the 3rd trimester, or when the fetus became viable, that it was able to live outside the uterus, the Supreme Court said that the state did have a compelling interest. And so at that point, like in the 3rd trimester of a woman's birth, or when a fetus became viable in the womb, the state could protect fetal life after that point by imposing restrictions, even banning abortion in those cases, although the Supreme Court said you did have to allow the exceptions to preserve the mother's life or health. Roe versus Wade says this explicitly, so this is why I say it's sometimes, I shouldn't say sometimes, a lot of times it's misrepresented, especially in the media. I don't know why, I'm just saying that this is what I've heard, and I listen to it, I'm like, no, that's not the case. But at least twice in the decision, it says the abortion right is not absolute. It's not an absolute right. So there can be restrictions, even bans, it can be outlawed with exceptions. So that was Roe versus Wade. So that was the operative law since 1973 until recently. Roe versus Wade was confirmed or reaffirmed in this other landmark decision called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was related to this state of Pennsylvania. It was decided in 1992, and there was a challenge to a Pennsylvania law which did not ban abortion, but it established requirements for abortion in the state. It established things like a waiting period, spousal notice that you had to, if you were married, you had to tell your husband that you were going to do it, which I'm surprised that passed. But anyways, parental consent for minors, etc. So that was challenged. Now notice the decision. We went from 7-2 with Roe versus Wade in the early 70s. By the 90s, it's not so sure. It's 5-4. Almost like it could have gone either way. All you needed was one more vote and they could have lost. But it was 5-4 against some parts of the Pennsylvania law, but other parts of the Pennsylvania law were actually upheld by the court. And the justices, even the justices in the 5 majority, I could say a plurality more than a majority, couldn't come to a complete agreement on all the issues in their final opinion. So it was a divided decision. Some parts of the opinion they all agreed on, other parts and sections of the opinion they didn't, and so they wrote, concurring opinions and dissenting opinions. So, frankly, when I'm looking at it as an outsider, it looks to me like a mess. It looks like a jumble. There clearly was not total agreement on what to do with the abortion issue by this time. What was becoming apparent with Planned Parenthood versus Casey was that Roe didn't work. So while the opinion was written by Sandra Day O'Connor. Now, why should you know Sandra Day O'Connor's name? Anything in recent memory? Is there any reason? Well, there are 2 reasons you should really remember her. Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice of the Supreme Court. What's one reason you should remember her? What's one reason to remember? That's okay. You just Sandra Day, your legacy is intact. Well, first of all, Mr. Thomas, she was the first woman justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, appointed back in the early 1980s, Sandra Day O'Connor. I guess I could say there were three things. Secondly, she wrote this opinion, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. That's the second thing, I guess. The third reason you should remember her is because she just died. So she was on the news. They were celebrating her life and her legacy as a Supreme Court justice and as a woman. Sandra Day. Okay. So she wrote this opinion, and clearly Roe wasn't working. She affirmed, and the plurality of justices affirmed the essential holding of Roe that abortion was a right under the right to privacy. Again, I'll say, not an absolute right. But she modified portions of Roe's contents, significant portions, which kind of opened the door for people to say, well, you know, if Roe versus Wade has such issues that you have to completely modify major portions of it, does it still work? Was it rightly decided? And that's how we get to this decision of 2022, which is Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which was challenging a Mississippi law which banned abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy, except for a medical emergency or fetal defect. So there were exceptions. And this law was challenged, and this was the one that a lot of people, well, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but some people were saying, you know, this was, if there was any case to overturn Roe on, this would be it, because already the door had been opened with Casey. So in a 6-3 judgment, it ruled that it reversed what Roe held, which is that the 14th Amendment had a right to privacy, which included abortion, and said this did not. Which did not outlaw abortion. It didn't say that abortion could not be. Okay, it overruled Roe and Casey, the precedents, but what it did do was it returned the power to regulate abortion back to each state. So basically what it did is it put the situation back to what it was before Roe versus Wade, where you had states that, said abortion was perfectly legal, but you had states that said it was not legal unless and would have certain exceptions. So what's the state of the abortion laws now? It's a jumble. So the positive law is something that we look to, and positive law should agree with natural law. It should agree with truth and should agree with reason, but human beings are not always truthful or reasonable or know what the natural law is. So there are all sorts of disagreements, and we see that in the United States. Okay, it's a diverse country. People disagree and have all sorts of different views. So the states that are in red are where they say it's banned, although nothing's really banned. When they say banned, there are always exceptions. So abortion is still permitted under certain exceptions, but in general there can be bans. There's no outright ban that in no circumstance can you have an abortion in the state. So banned is a little bit misleading, but nevertheless. States that are orange and yellow have it's banned, but they have it banned under certain, like 12 weeks and 15 weeks. In some states it's in legal limbo, it's under review by the court system. And then in the states that are light blue and kind of purplish, it's protected by law or protected by the Constitution. So you see, how it is. It's almost equally divided in the way it is in the United States. When we look for public opinion, Americans' preferences about the legality of abortion have remained pretty stable over the last few decades. If you look here, Americans' preference, it's about, legal under any circumstances and illegal in all circumstances. is still, here, the 29% is that it should be legal under any circumstances. So that's obviously not the majority, but it's also not the majority that should be illegal in all circumstances. That's 20%, so that's like 10 points less. Most Americans are in that kind of mushy middle, where it should be legal only under certain circumstances. It's been hovering around the 50 percentile since the mid-1970s. Now, for our purposes, what's interesting for our purposes is the question of the morality of abortion. And so Gallup polls ask people about the morality of abortion. And that's interesting, because that's fluctuating. But back in 2000, this is over the last 20-some years, greed is morally acceptable and morally wrong. And for most of this, morally wrong has been the majority. And now it's started to shift, or at least it's started to, it's been around 50% in the 50s, but now morally acceptable is starting to go up. I don't know if that's a generational thing, just new generations, Generation Z or whatever it's called. But now it's about equal now. 47% say no, it's wrong, or morally, 46% say no, it's morally wrong, and 47% say yes, it's morally right. Okay, so it's about half and half. So we could go either way on it. There's not clarity necessarily. Okay, I'll start talking. We have other resources for reflection, which are the Revelation and Magisterium, and I will talk about those next week. Talk about those at the next class on Thursday. God bless you all. Good to see you. Maybe I won't. Well, we'll see what happens. You're welcome, sir. Have a good day, sir. We'll see what happens. Doobie-doobie-doo.